Now, I know there's an issue for some of you about antibodies. All of us have got antibodies. All of us are actually born with odd antibodies against cross species. You know, they're there. There are some of you and some of us who develop antibodies, particularly women who've had children, particularly anybody who's had platelets, a transfusion for whatever reason at some stage, who produce antibodies against common proteins, if you like, that are present on an organ that we're going to be getting from a donor. And a high titer of those antibodies within lung transplantation signifies much higher risks in terms of getting a good long-term outcome, and may affect candidature for transplantation. There are strategies, and we're looking at how we can reduce antibodies pre-transplant. And in some organs, there's more advanced understanding of the interaction between antibodies and outcome following transplantation. In lung transplantation, it's still not absolutely clear. So there may be for some, and I hope it explains why, and we can talk about that later if anyone's particularly interested in it, why the presence of preformed antibodies can be an issue. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether you should give one lung or two, and there's an awful lot of heat and often not so much light about this topic. I would point out, if we look at the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation, this is quite a busy slide, but if you come down here, this is the pecking order. So this is Manchester United, and down here is Newcastle United, sadly. Somewhere in the mid-table is LAM, although you can see, in terms of the rarer disorders, it's probably top of the pops. But you can see worldwide, in terms of the data, only 194 patients registered with the ISHLT. Now, there may well be worldwide who've had transplants up to this time for LAM. And the majority, you can see, will have had bilateral or two lungs, and a minority have had one. But it does put things into perspective with you, actually. We've got a significant proportion of the world's lung transplants are LAM sitting in this meeting today. Now, that's to say, the ISHLT has won't have the data from smaller transplant units who've made them sporadic odd patients, but it gives you a flavour of the sort of rare team that we've got here. Now, if one takes, let's just take COPD for example. Over the years, there's been an increasing trend by surgical colleagues to carry out bilateral lungs, and there are some data suggesting that the outcomes of bilateral lung, in terms of the long-term outcome, are better if you put two lungs in compared to one. Because if lungs wear out in time, and they can wear out after a transplant, if you've got two new lungs, then you can kind of argue, well, the rate of, if they're both deteriorating at the same rate, if you've got two lungs, you'll do better than if you've got one lung. Yeah, well, that works up to a point, but I don't totally subscribe to that. One of the big problems is that in some centres, patients got inappropriate decisions regarding single or double lungs, and some of the smaller centres are only doing, instead of 50 a year, we're again, our transplant centres probably in the top 5, 6 worldwide, much better than our football team. With more experience, the less experienced centres, there may be issues regarding the appropriateness of doing single lung transplantation. If one looks, interestingly, at those, and I showed you those studies earlier, and you look at the proportion, back in 1996, when Annette Berler first published in the New England Journal the sort of ISHLT data on lung transplantation for LAM, about 79% had single and only 21% double. It was then, over the years and going towards 2009, the French are a little bit different. They've always liked, as we have actually, in Newcastle, single lung transplants for them, 76%. But the literature has suggested that there was an ever decreasing number of single lung transplants and increasing double lung transplants. And that really, I think, is mirroring what I was saying was going on in COPD. when I looked at our database, I reckon we've done 11 patients over our experience, 8 of whom had single and 3 double. And we've got the mentality of not one size fits all. We look individually at patients generally. And in our hands, and really looking carefully at the data, in LAM I think the outcomes seem the same. And decision making should be based on other issues. If you've got a completely fused pleural space on one side, but there's no infection, you've had a talc pleurodesis on one side, maybe done multiply, and you can see on the scans that lung is going to take ages. It'll be chipped out. Knife and fork is what you probably need to get it out, rather than careful dissection, because that lung is welded to the inside of your chest. And it makes no sense to us to spend 6 hours in the operating theatre trying to take that lung out. If it's not going to do any harm, leave it there. So if the pleural space is completely obliterated and you're otherwise suitable for a transplant on the other side, let's do a nice quick operation and do the single lung on the other side. That's very important. You can only do that if there's no evidence of chronic infection in the lung you're going to leave behind. And if there are bilateral, despite best attempts, recurrent problematic pneumothoraces on both sides, and you can already predict that if you only put one lung in, you're going to be plagued by having pneumothoraces on the native side, you may as well put 2 lungs in, and that's been very much our approach. Well, the first question patients who come up to see us is, what the results like? So, that's a very good question. If you look at the international literature, and many of you will potentially will have looked at on the websites the sort of outcome. First of all, I'd say that the international society, as I've said before, collates a lot of data over the years, and you can see for the epochs here, 88 to 94, 95 to 99, and then up to 2005, we are getting better at doing the operation. But the international figures don't really give the true outcome for the bigger centres, because there are centres here only doing 4 or 5 transplants a year. There's clear evidence if you're doing 20 transplants a year compared to less than 20, your outcomes are better, simply just because of familiarity and so forth. So if we look at our own experiences, and I did this a year ago with 629 transplants carried out, you can see really quite significant improvements in terms of pre-1996, post-1996, which I took as the cut-off. What I would say to you that in our hands now, we would be offering a 50% survival, which would be approaching 10 years, and our aims over now, in the early days of transplantation, we were very much focusing on getting patients through the first year and understanding the difficulties of getting the various joins where the new lung is joined to the old windpipe and so forth, and airways, getting that right. We're now much more focusing, because all of that's sorted out. The surgical issues are pretty well sorted. The main issues are now not only thinking about keeping the lung in good shape for 10, 20 years, but keeping the rest of the body in good shape around that lung, because we've now got a much better understanding of the side effects that the immunosuppressive drugs give and produce.